Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to PCI Webinars. Today's webinar, 20 books to recommend, whether you've read them or not, and why they are important. I am one of the speakers for today. I run my own business called Library Discount Network out of Cincinnati, Ohio, and we get we negotiate our database vendors to get the biggest discount we have, primarily for libraries in Kentucky. I also provide administration and management support for nonprofit organizations. George Maley earned a BA in political science from Xavier University in 1978 and read law at the University of Cincinnati and completed his JD in 1981. He was called to the bar in 1981 and practiced law in Ohio for 38 years. In a purely autotelic pursuit, at age 60, he decided to obtain a master's degree in American history from Southern New Hampshire University, the Harvard of Southern New Hampshire. After earning this degree, he was named an outstanding student in the program, earning a 4.0 grade point while being at least 30 years older than his classmates and most of his instructors. His master's thesis was a study of Jim Crow in small-town Kentucky. We'll bring to you now 20 books to recommend, whether you have read them or not, and why they are important. That's actually the two of us at our favorite place, the Greenbrier, and George is there in the corner also at the Greenbrier. So what we're going to cover, the first thing is the question that many of us get: what are you reading? Then I'm going to do a very brief thing on best of book lists, because we've been studying book lists for the past few months in preparation for this webinar. And then we're going to talk about the books to recommend. I think there are more than 20 of them, but I haven't ever counted. And there will be time for questions at the end, or you can feel free to ask questions at any time, and I will pick them up out of the discussion area. First of all, what are you reading? As a librarian, or actually anyone who works in a library, you probably get this question all the time. I know that I get it. And interestingly, I'm not much of a reader, never have been. I fell into libraries more than 30 years ago. I do try to pick up my reading as much as possible and read more than I used to, primarily nonfiction. But I think we all as librarians, or people who work in libraries, get this question because people somehow think that we know the best books to read. I know my neighbor's always asking me what I'm reading, but that's not necessarily the case. A lot of times we know we should read something, but have never taken the time to do it, or we just like a different sort of book or a different genre, so we never read those books that we think would be good for our patrons to be reading. We were talking about this at the dinner table. George is my husband, by the way, several months ago, and he suggested that we put this presentation together because there are so many books that librarians should have read, and there's so many times where we're asked to provide recommendations. So based on his research and books he's read through the years, he decided to put this list together, and we hope that it'll help you out, whether you want to read these books yourselves or whether you want to just be able to recommend them. This gives you a little deeper dive into some of the things that he is calling classic. She also brings up best of book lists. Where do these things come from? And should we be using them? Are they important? The first thing when you're looking at that is consider the source. You might see a best of list in a newspaper or a magazine, such as the New York Times list or something like that. They could do a best books of the year, best books in a certain genre, things like that. They may have a reason for doing that. Of course, publishers always put out their best of book lists. We get these at American Library Association all the time. The publishers will provide you with a best of, and they're usually pointing you to their books, of course. You could select award winners, the award winners from one of the ALA divisions or someplace else. They put out their best of lists. Or there could be individuals. George will be citing later an individual's 100 best books or 100 favorite books. And that's another place to get best of recommendations. Before you use one of those best of book lists, I recommend that you look at previous lists, particularly if it's an annual book list, And that'll let you know if you agree with that list, if you want to be using that list, or if it's something that just doesn't apply to you at all. Another thing to look for are the criteria that are being used to select those best books. If it's a publisher or a newspaper, they should be letting you know what their criteria is, besides just trying to sell you books. So always look for the criteria of those best of lists before you use them, because that'll give you a better idea of whether those are valid best of books or just something that publisher or newspaper wanted to feature to sell books or for whatever reason. So now George is here to provide you with his recommended books for your patrons. George?
Thank you. As it is such an investment in time, it is difficult to recommend a book. Often reading is a question of taste. Sometimes even style over content or the author's ability prevails over the subject matter himself. For example, if you like Hemingway, you'll read anything from Hemingway. Today we're going to ramble around some books. Think of it as a leisurely shelf browse, where there will be a few classics, some new books, some possibly obscure works, but I am hopeful something for everybody. Imagine that I'm simply pulling things I know out of the stacks to try to tickle your fancy. And I want to tell you that I have gone out. And I've gone out. And okay. I'm sorry, guys. I've got the circle of deaths going around. So I'll go on, and Anne can probably move the slides. If you're interested in the Second World War and you really want to make a time commitment, then I would suggest Winston Churchill's 6-volume History of World War II. At 3,578 pages of text, this was a massive undertaking, which Churchill supports with his own contemporary correspondence and that of Stalin, FDR, and others. The next slide is a picture of Winston Churchill, and this is an interesting picture. In fact, it sits to my left in my office. It was taken on the shores of Britain, probably in 1939, and it shows Churchill with a Tommy gun. What's interesting about it is it's kind of cool, but beyond that, the Nazis used this picture as propaganda to portray Churchill as a gangster. And he kind of looks like a gangster, apart from the bow tie and the bowler, with that really hardy machine gun in his hand. Anyway, after earning my master's degree in American history last spring, the first history I wanted to read for fun was Churchill. Because of Churchill's idiosyncratic speaking voice, which you may be familiar with from Gary Oldman's film impression, the text reads not unlike an audiobook. Because none of the principal players in the Second World War wrote a known history, and this is not a general history, it is Churchill's personal history, warts and all, and there are many warts. I have put up the definition of warts and all because it's of interest. The protector of Britain, Oliver Cromwell, who took over after Charles I got his head chopped off, and he was the ruler of England until Charles II was restored to the crown, wanted to have his picture painted with warts and all. And you can see he has warts and all in that picture. What makes Churchill's history of the Second World War so important is his voice. And the inescapable fact leaps from every volume. The war leaders were as much in the wrong as they were in the right. And there were more than a healthy portion of serious errors of judgments, tactics, and expectations to go around. For example, in Volume 2, which is the pictured slide, which covers 1940, Churchill relates the story of Russian Foreign Minister Molotov greeting German Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop in Berlin. After the talks in which von Ribbentrop told Molotov that the English were finished, dinner was served, but the party had to retire to the cellar in the air raid shelter as the English Air Force were bombing Berlin. Churchill had gotten wind of the meeting and for purely symbolic reasons ordered the air raid. After listening to von Ribbentrop all day repeat that the English were finished during the raid, Molotov is reported to have said to von Ribbentrop, "If the English are done, why are we in the basement and who is bombing us?" Because of the sheer length of the history of World War II, it may not be for anyone, but anyone who claims to be a Second World War buff, it is a must-read. For the less stout-hearted reader, William L. Shirer's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich is a very good recommendation. Shirer was the CBS correspondent in Berlin in the run-up to the war. The stable of CBS reporters for the war reads like a who's who of early American broadcasting. Edward R. Murrow, Richard C. Hodlett, Eric Sevareid, William Shirer, and others. It's interesting to note that Walter Cronkite, who has been on the TV with the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, was not at that time with CBS. Shirer's book is a complete and skillful examination of the causes and consequences of the rise of Nazism in Germany. Should your patron be interested in the Pacific theater of war, then I would recommend Prisoners of the Japanese by Gavin Dawes. This is not, by any means, an easy read. Dawes goes into excruciating detail of the mistreatment of Allied prisoners by their captors. It might be forgotten, but between 1939 and, say, 1942, Japan rolled across the Pacific, crushing the colonial Dutch and English. Further, they, in the wake of Pearl Harbor, had vanquished the American fleet and military presence in the region. In other words, there were many Westerners in captivity for a very long time. As Dawes related, the Japanese believed that the Westerners and the Chinese were racially inferior and did not feel in any way compelled to abide by any international system of military justice in the treatment of their prisoners. Thanks to Gavin Dawes, I refuse to drive Japanese cars. If you would like to understand race relations in America today, then there is no better book than one published 100 years ago. W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folks. There is hardly a pundit, scholar, historian, or village idiot who doesn't pull a chestnut or two from Du Bois's book-length essay. I wonder, however, how many have actually read it. So you ask, how can a guy born 3 years after the Civil War ended in 1868 still be relevant today? The easy answer is that not much has changed between 1908, when this book was published, and 2019. But the more comprehensive answer is that Du Bois was a keen observer of black and white relations, and his observations still, unfortunately, ring true in the 21st century, and certainly in the 20th century. If you don't believe me, then compare the recently published Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America by Ibram X. Kendi. You would be surprised to find that there are common themes in both works, although Kendi is rightfully angry. I say angry because the first slaves were brought to what would become America in 1620. You would think that in about 400 years, we would have been able to implement Jefferson's words, "All men are created equal." Of course, these words were just another chestnut from Jefferson, because Jefferson only meant white men, and he only meant white men who held property. In addition, here are several more titles on race relations worth recommending. These are all recent. Nancy Eisenberg's White Trash, The 400-Year Untold History of Class in America, Christina DeRocher's Raising Races, The Socialization of White Children in the Jim Crow South, and Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, Why It Is So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. Each one of these books is significant in its own right, but they all take a slightly different perspective to the topic of American race relations. To shift gears a little bit, when I was growing up in the late 1960s, the forbidden fruit of American literature was J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. The required and more sedate assigned reading was F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. Upon rereading them both recently, it is interesting to note the blatant subversiveness of both works. First published in 1951, Catcher found itself banned. Given modern sensibility, Catcher has become, over the years, a little tame. But to a young teenage boy in the 60s, it was the bee's knees, for it portrayed a world where everybody, including the main character Holden Caulfield, were phonies. Salinger holds up a mirror to the mid-20th century American life, and the reflection is shallow and wanting. Published a little more than 25 years before Catcher, Gatsby has been hailed as the great American novel. And if you don't agree, at least it's the greatest novel to emerge out of the Jazz Age. Fitzgerald explores the vapidity of the newly made wealth and power of the Roaring Twenties. Of the two books, Jay Gatsby has aged much better than Holden Caulfield, despite the four just plain awful screen versions of the novel. At the end of the 1974 Robert Redford Mia Farrow fiasco, I was rooting for the character George B. Wilson to shoot Gatsby and put me out of my misery. There has never been a authorized film version of Catcher. J.D. Salinger wouldn't sell the rights. It is interesting to note that Salinger locked himself away in Vermont until his death, eschewing contact with the world and his legion of fans. And Fitzgerald simply drank himself to death. Having lived in Vermont, on the whole, I much prefer the latter to the former. Classic science fiction suffers from dating, and it could be argued that two of the most well-known classic science fiction titles, Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 and George Orwell's 1984, may be subject to this interpretation. First published in 1953, Bradbury created a world where video media controls all. Reading is illegal, and books are burned by firemen who start fires rather than put them out. The tale is one fireman who becomes obsessed with reading and throws away his career and his family and escapes to become a book person. Having memorized his favorite book, he then burns it himself. It is frightening indeed to think of a world that would evolve where people would spend their lives staring into screen and satiating themselves on the lies told to them nightly from television the size of their walls. Boy, it's a good thing that will never happen in America. Can you imagine driving with roads full of people glued to small screens? Although 1984 was actually 35 years ago, Orwell's 1984 portrays a total state control with attendant surveillance and state brutality. Although first published in 1949, from 1984 the words and phrases Big Brother, Doublethink, Thought Crime, Newspeak, Room 101, Telescreen, and my personal favorite, 2 + 2 = 5, have become part of our language. Like Fahrenheit, this vision of the world has not come to pass. Well, apart from the 24/7 institutionalized governmental video surveillance, and the fact that in 2016 America could boast 2,298,300 persons being incarcerated. Clearly, 1984 hasn't happened. A side note, these two novels were adapted into two excellent films. The 1984 version of 1984 stars John Hurt and Richard Burton, with music by the Eurythmics. The legendary French film director Francois Truffaut did a marvelous job with Fahrenheit 451, which starred Oscar Werner and the incomparable Julie Christie. These films may be in your video collection, and they're well worth pulling out. I'm always fascinated when I meet someone captivated by the American Civil War. Generally, they are caught up in the myths that were foisted on the American people after the Great Struggle. Please note that the Confederate statues of which we are arguing about today were erected not directly after the war, but in the 20th century, often 50 years after the war, with their own political agendas when erected. There are essentially two types of Civil War history, those that perpetuate those myths and those that are accurate. Although highly recommended, and I even own it, Shelby Foote's classic 3-volume Civil War falls into the former myth category. Foote can really write, and he tells the history with panache. Although a long task, Foote's writing is so good that it reads like a cool drink on a hot day. If you remember Ken Burns' television series, The Civil War, Shelby Foote appears as himself, the Southern gentleman casually sitting on the couch, imparting brief words of wisdom. On the other hand, perhaps not as well known as Foote's Civil War, is James M. McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom. Equally as well written as Foote's account, McPherson represents modern scholarship regarding the war, which rejects the lost cause myth, which was created by the South in the post-war period. The lost cause myth argues that the cause of the South was not slavery, but rather states' rights, that the leaders of the South were not racist, and the war could not have been won given the general gentility of the South. All of this was and continues to be nonsense, as McPherson convincingly demonstrates. The great thing, however, is that both books are wonderful reads, if you separate the body counts. Of Civil War books not to recommend, and this is kind of off the topic, but I do want to get it in, is that of the noted plagiarist Doris Kearns Goodwin, Team of Rivals. I hate to be dismissive, but it is simply unreadable. I knew all the principal characters in the story, and still Dr. Goodwin could not arouse my interest. This despite being a personal favorite book of President Obama. I suspect that many of the copies purchased are now better employed as paperweights. When I was preparing this presentation, I ran across David Bowie's 100 favorite books. There's the link. A number of books recommended today are on that list, because classics remain classic. Mr. B's list contains a couple of books that I read some years ago and rather enjoy. The first is Yukio Mishima's The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea, and Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. It's nice to know that I have something in common with The Thin White Duke. Neither of these books are for everyone. Rather more, they are for the mature reader who understand the violence contained in each book. For Mishima, Honor, Glory, and Manliness is seen through the eyes of a 14-year-old boy with the concurrent disappointment that runs throughout the novel. For Capote, In Cold Blood is a cold, hard exercise in prose. its crime and punishment from its beginning to the hangman's noose. I suppose they are on Bowie's list because they are, in their own way, extremely compelling works. And as we know, Bowie liked to read. According to one of his biographers, until his ritualistic suicide in 1970, Mishima was the leading candidate to be the first Japanese author to be awarded the Nobel Prize. Sadly, Truman Capote became little more than a cartoon character in later life after the success of In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's, appearing on countless talk shows and being a celebrity rather than a great American author. On the other hand, Bowie remains today a vital influence on popular music and culture, even though he has passed. Humor and war are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Joseph Heller's Catch-22 and Richard Hooker's MASH are examples of short, funny novels set in the Second World War and the Korean conflict. Heller's troop of misfits are pilots who would rather be doing anything else, especially plotting their escape, but doing bombing missions. Hooker, as you know from the movie and television versions of MASH, are Army doctors who do not let the war get in the way of a good time. Reading Hooker, one realizes how faithful both the film and the television series were to his vision. Hollywood, this time, didn't mess up on MASH. The film version of Catch-22 was okay, but it failed to capture the scope of the book, and rather more focused on the idiosyncratic nature of Heller's characters at the expense of the narrative. It is one of the few screen appearances of the comic Bob Newhart, so it might be worth looking at just for that. These books are absurdist or black humor in very readable formats. And the nice thing about these two books is that they can both be read in the time it takes you to get about a third of the way through Thomas Pynchon's gigantic Gravity's Rainbow. Pynchon explores some of the same comic themes, but compact writing was never his strong suit. There is much, much more going on than Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, and it's well worth a read, but it is a long and winding journey and may ultimately not be satisfying, whereas Catch-22 and MASH only occasionally meander from the humor. Pynchon has a bigger fish to fry. In my view, biography is a very difficult topic in literature upon which to make recommendations. I think people tend to biographies of people they admire or want to know more about, except for the monsters of history, who have their own special place in biography, like Lenin, Stalin, and Hitler. Most people want to read about romantic couples like Wallace Simpson or Edward VII, or men like Lincoln, who was raised from rail splitter to immortality. For Stalin, try Donald Rumsfeld's Stalin and his Hangman. For Lenin, I suggest The Life and Death of Lenin by Robert Payne. Both of these biographies reveal the sheer brutality of these two Russian leaders. It's a bit of rough sledding for both of them because there is a significant body count involved. For Wallace and Edward, I suggest Byron and Murphy's The Windsor Story. It tells the story of the star-crossed couple. Sadly, however, I came away from it not liking either of them and questioning Edward's loyalty to Britain. For something completely different, I suggest the biography of Vivian Stanshall, Ginger Geezer, The Life of Vivian Stanshall by Lucian Randall and Chris Welsh. You may rightly ask, who the heck was Vivian Stanchel? Yes, it is a he. Vivian in Britain is both a male and female name. He was a contemporary of the Beatles and the frontman for something called the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band. His twisted short life is both entertaining and sad. In fact, the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band was a favorite of Paul McCartney and appears in the Beatles' film Magical Mystery Tour, singing their maybe hit, Death Cab for Cutie, which went on to be borrowed as a title for another rock and roll group. A number of years ago, while in London, we saw Adam Long's comedy musical Dickens Unplugged, which was a musical romp through 5 Dickens novels. One of Long's points was that all of Dickens is pretty much like all the rest of Dickens. So whether it is Great Expectations, Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, or any other of the rather long novels, the plots involve characters who find themselves at heels only to rise above their circumstances and triumph in the end. On a slightly different note, however, is Dickens' short novella, A Christmas Carol. It's a wonderful introduction to Dickens. The writing and the flow are excellent, and he doesn't take 200 pages of exposition to get to the story. Of course, this is because Dickens' novels were first published in serialized versions, so naturally, they take a while to get going. Heck, he was probably paid by the word. By the way, if you're looking for an entertaining Christmas film, The Man Who Invented Christmas, which stars Downton Abbey's own Dan Stevens, is a very funny and family-oriented film. There's Mr. Stevens right there. Anyway, The Christmas Carol can be read by any level of reader, whether they're young or adult, and it is thoroughly enjoyable. I reread it every Christmas season because it's just so darn good. Another book that began as a serialized version was by fellow Victorian Oscar Wilde. Wilde was one of the first people to cultivate famous for just being famous. His short and only novel is the Gothic The Picture of Dorian Gray. It tells the story of Dorian Gray, who sells his soul so that he may live a debauched life, while his portrait, hidden from view, embraces his many sins. Naturally, when it was first published, it offended Victorian taste. It surprisingly has aged rather well. And the belief of some people who appear ageless, and the belief that some people who appear ageless must have a picture hidden away in their house is part of modern culture, even if the speaker has no idea from whence this reference derives. A lesser-known contemporary of both Dickens and Wilde was Wilkie Collins. I mentioned earlier that I knew all the principal characters in Doris Kearns Goodwin's team of rival. Collins bears a resemblance in this photo to Lincoln's Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton's. Collins' 1859 novel, The Woman in White, is considered to be the first mystery novel. It might be of interest to mystery fans to see how the genre began. Andrew Lloyd Webber admired the novel so much that he made it into a musical in 2004. It wasn't much of a mystery when Webber was finished with it, but there certainly was a murder. My last selection for this presentation is a book that I believe that every librarian should read. Oops, let's get by The Woman in White. There we go. It's The Desegregation of Public Libraries in the Jim Crow South by the married team of Shirley and Wayne Wygant. As a side note, Wayne taught Anne at the University of Kentucky's MLS program for more years than she wishes to mention. This year, the Wygants won the ALA's Eliza Atkins Gleason Book Award for this compelling history. There is some justice in this, since the American Library Association was a stance opponent to the integration of libraries. Yep, that's right. The ALA went out of its way to prevent African American access. As they tell us in the book, the ALA's upper echelon was dominated by white Southern men. If you happen to work at a Carnegie library, take note of the rear or side door that only goes down and not up. This door leads to the African American collection, which, by the way, never included a card catalog. The Carnegie Trust turned a blind eye to equal access for African Americans when doling out money for libraries. The standard Southern argument was that African Americans could obtain any book in the collection, but without access to the card catalog, they never knew what was actually in the collection. There is much in this book regarding the segregation of libraries in Florida. A reading of this wonderful book could result in a display regarding the history of your own library's integration. I'm proud to say that when Cincinnati opened its first public library in 1868, it was integrated. As the Weingards tell us, it took nearly 100 years for the South to catch up. So there you have it, a little saunter around the shelves among the classics, with a few newer things tossed in. There should be no fear regarding reading these older works, as there's still much life within their pages. They remain accessible, even today. Even someone like Ray Bradbury can still spark a flame. The promo to this presentation mentioned children's book, but our friend Joe Borghese has cornered the market on children's literature. So next time she appears for PCI, make sure you pop in for a presentation. You will not be disappointed. Thank you for your attention. When I was researching my master's thesis, I would often just get a call number in the general area of my study and go directly to the shelf and see what was around it. I never struck out. Every time I visited a library, and these were generally college libraries, my research went in a new and very promising direction just by going to the shelf and not worrying particularly about the age of the book. It never hurts to take a look at what you may already have, even though it might be just a little bit dusty and not have been touched for years. I thank you for your attention.
Okay, we're ready to take questions now, or any comments you might have about the books. You'll see that it was a little bit focused in direction on Civil War and desegregation, obviously, because of George's history interests, but he delved off into other things as well, which I'm happy to say he was able to do that. And if you have any questions or comments, Andrew's saying something, of course. Nope, maybe not. I want to know what you're reading. As people who work in libraries, what do you read? How do you select the books that you recommend for your patrons? And perhaps if you read any of these and want to question George's input and give a little shout out for the books that you think deserve more, particularly Doris Kearns Goodwin, since she ends up appearing at ALA nearly every year and seems to be...
And you can hardly turn on the television and not see her anymore.
Yeah. Andrew says it's fascinating about the ALA and race. That's why George recommends that book, because I did not read the whole thing myself, but he kept bumping into things about libraries that I never knew. It occurred to me about that back door at the Carnegie Library. If you don't know the door we're talking about, in the library I'm thinking of, it's the door on the right side of the library that goes down a long flight of steps. Actually, no, it only goes down a short flight of steps and enters onto the children's room and the programming space. But it is pretty obvious that back door was meant for something else. I haven't been able to actually find that was the African American section, because I don't think anyone wants to admit it. But they didn't want the African Americans going in the front door of the library, so they reserved that library or that door around back for them. Let's see, Marlon says the television version of Catch-22 that is on now is pretty good. Oh, good. I didn't even know there was we don't have a television, so I didn't realize that there was one. And Brittany asks, what are some new fiction books that you see becoming classics that are great to recommend? Ooh, fiction's not a good thing to ask, George. Let's ask everybody else fiction and what they want to recommend. I also don't read any fiction at all. Brooke Smith says I'm reading Home by Nightfall by Charles Finch. And Kathy says The Book of Phoenix by Okorafor. And Andrew says he didn't know the group Death Cab for Cutie took their name from a Beatles song. Melissa recommends.
It's not a Beatles song. It's a Bonzo Dog doodah band song.
Melissa says, love the library book by Susan Orlean. Any other recommendations?
If you want to know the source of Doris Kearns Goodwin's plagiarism, the book Past Imperfect by Peter Charles Hoffer explores how Kearns Goodwin, writing her history of Eleanor Roosevelt, lifted entire sections from a previous published work, and her publisher paid the prior author $20,000 to shut up. So that's why I can rightfully call her a plagiarist, because she did it and she bought her way out of it.
It's interesting that ALA shows so much support for her when she is a known plagiarizer. Any other suggestions? I love the ones you put in so far. Loved Wench by Dolan Perkins Valdez. That's contributed by Jen Johnson. Thank you, Jen. As I said, I'm not a really good fiction person. I will recommend the best book of last year on a lot of people's book lists, which was Educated. If you have not read that book, you should. Every librarian should read the book. It says an awful lot about people, and a lot about just how people interact with one another, and about the value of education in one person's life. But she was on the talk show circuit as well. But it's probably the best book I've read in many, many years. And Amy agrees with me. Education was an eye-opening book. Very easy to read, too. Kathy suggests The Overstory by Powers. I love this. I love the fact you're filling us in on the fiction, the part that we could not do. Marlon, go out and buy it. Not that much. Marlon is waiting for Educated. You'll probably never be able to get it. The whole list on Educated has got to be just super long. Any other suggestions? Marlon's reading A History of the World in 6 Drinks. That sounds like my kind of book. And Andrew suggests Susan Choi, Trust Exercise. All right, any other comments or questions? We ran a little bit short, but George is not a professional speaker, so I was thinking he was going to run over after putting all these slides together. It just seemed it was endless. All right, I want to thank you for attending. Hope you got something out of it. Again, the slides are there in the downloads area if you want them. And I want to thank George for putting this together. Not a professional speaker, but I think he did a good job of selecting some things in a variety of categories that we could now recommend to patrons. So thanks, everybody. It was great to have you here, and we will see you again at the next PCI webinar. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.